In 1988, the FBI wrote a report on the Jack the Ripper murders at the request of a TV show that aired to mark the 100th anniversary of the Autumn of Terror. This report and its author, Supervisory Special Agent John E. Douglas, have since achieved an elevated semi-mythical status in the rarefied world of ripperology. Probably contributing to this was the gravitas afforded by the appearance of the actor Peter Ustinov as the moderator of the resulting TV documentary The Secret Identity of Jack the Ripper. To give a flavour of this programme, the suspects it considered were Rosalind de Onsen, Sir William Gull, Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski and Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence. The investigation started with the misidentification of the crime scene where Mary Ann Nichols was murdered. From this unpromising beginning, the programme proceeded to regurgitate one falsehood after another. Nevertheless, I'll provide a link to this documentary in the description below, as however inaccurate, it is of historic interest. But the focus of this investigation is the actual written report, which arguably wasn't targeted at the mass market for popular entertainment, and so one might expect it to be a serious, sober assessment. It's only a 7-page report, and the first 2.5 go through generalities about the victims and their injuries. Douglas reflected, in each homicide, the victim was a prostitute with a reputation for drinking quite heavily. The prostitutes targeted by Jack the Ripper were nearly twice the age of prostitutes soliciting today. They were not particularly attractive. This sensible observation followed. The Jack the Ripper victims were targeted because they were readily accessible. Jack the Ripper did not have to initiate the contact. In other words, the victims probably approached their killer first, rather than the killer approaching the victim. He then went on to discuss the crime and the crime scene analysis, saying, all homicides occurred within 1/4 of a mile from each other and occurred either on Friday, Saturday or Sunday during the early morning hours. After the first homicide at Whitechapel station, the subject moved slightly across town 1/4 of a mile. This places the crime scene in far too tight an area. It was not 1/4 of a mile between Bucks Row, where Polly Nichols was murdered, and Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman was murdered. It's a bit more than 3/4 of a mile. Not 1/4 of a mile, but over 3/4 of a mile. That's quite a difference. Then, if a line is drawn from crime scenes 2, 3, 4 and 5, a triangular configuration is formed. This is a bit of a strange claim to make, as a triangle cannot be formed when you connect 4 points. A triangle is from 3 points. In this instance, you get a lopsided square. This triangular configuration is viewed as a secondary comfort zone for the Ripper. This movement is caused when a subject believes that the investigation is heating up in his primary comfort zone. But what if it isn't triangular, but quadrilateral? The primary comfort zone would be the location of the first homicide in the vicinity of Whitechapel station. Maybe, but was that the first homicide? Douglas seems to question this with his very next sentence. It is the opinion of this crime analyst that there were other attacks in the Whitechapel area that either went unreported or for some reason were not considered by authorities to be the crimes of Jack the Ripper. So if you misidentify the first homicide, this zonal analysis will all go askew. The inclusion of Martha Taborn, for example, would throw this analysis out of kilter. Then Douglas discusses the behaviour of the killer. A subject will change his modus operandi as he gains additional experience. This is learned behaviour. However, the personal desires and needs of the subject are expressed in the ritual aspects of a crime. The ritual is something that you must always do because it is the acting out of the fantasy. With Jack the Ripper, the target selection, the approach, the method of his initial attack are his modus operandi. What takes place after this is the ritual. The ritual may become more elaborate, as was in the last homicide case. Here, the Ripper had time to act out his fantasies. As investigators, we should not necessarily expect the same type of homicides in the future, particularly if subsequent victims are killed outdoors. I would suggest that this approach is far too rigid. Experience since then has told investigators that they should not second guess what a serial killer may or may not do, and seemingly unrelated crimes, because the ritual or the modus operandi are totally dissimilar, may in fact be linked. In various previous films, I've mentioned a critical FBI symposium on serial killers held in San Antonio, Texas in 2005. Perhaps the most significant statement resulting from this event was, "There is no single identifiable cause or factor that leads to the development of a serial killer. Rather, there are multiple factors that contribute to their development. The most significant factor is the serial killer's personal decision in choosing to pursue their crimes." I'll provide a link to this report in the description below. Every serious student of true crime should read it very carefully. I'll do a full episode on it at some point. The meat of the 1988 report is the section entitled Offender Traits and Characteristics. Douglas regarded these as lust murders, where the word lust does not mean love or have any sexual meaning other than the fact that the subject attacks the genital areas of his victims. The vaginal area and breasts are the focal point of attack. And it is for this reason that Jack the Ripper was a male. He was of white race in view of the fact that white was the predominant race at the crime scene locations, and generally crimes such as these are intra-racial. It's worth considering that if the crime was intra-racial, within racial boundaries, how Jewish suspects fit into this pattern. Most Jewish migrants had arrived from very poor and socially and economically backwards parts of Eastern Europe. Jewish people were largely regarded as being from a separate racial group at this time, and also regarded themselves as being very distinct. This begs the question whether it would be more likely that a Jewish individual would likely engage in a serial killing spree where the victims were not Jewish. One might recall that in the case of the most notorious murder in the East End prior to the Jack the Ripper murders, where the perpetrator was Jewish, the victim was also Jewish. I refer, of course, to the murder of Miriam Angel by Israel Lipsky in 1887, the year before the Jack the Ripper murders took place. There are several well-known Jewish Jack the Ripper suspects with a recent Eastern European background, such as Aaron Kosminski, and various alternative Kosminskis, such as David Cohen or Nathan Kaminsky. If Douglas follows his own point here, this would effectively exclude them from consideration. This wouldn't apply to the same degree to Jewish suspects such as Jacob Levy or Chaim Hyams, because they were born in England. Douglas continued, the age of onset for these types of homicides generally between the mid to late 20s. Based upon the degree of psychopathology exhibited at the scene, the ability of this subject to converse with the victim until a suitable location is found, and the ability to avoid detection places him between the age bracket of 28 to 36 years of age. However, it should be noted that age is a difficult characteristic to categorise, and consequently we would not eliminate a viable suspect exclusively because of age. As mentioned previously, we cannot be sure these were the first murders committed by the perpetrator, so we cannot know the age of onset for these type of homicides. If the first murder was earlier than 1888, then the culprit's age in 1888 might be a bit older. So the question of age is very open, as Douglas concedes. But as the canonical murders that Douglas is primarily examining commenced in 1888, by his judgment, the culprit cannot realistically have been under 28, which would tend to discount Kosminski, for example, who was 22 or 23 at the time. Douglas is also suggesting here that the culprit must have had self-assurance in his dealings with the victims to be able to converse confidently without raising suspicion, and to be able to spin this along until he reached the murder location, and from there to avoid detection. This analysis is surely true, and that is why he placed the culprit in the slightly older category, older than suspects like Kosminski, for example, who also had poor English and, according to the reports we have, would not have acted in a normal manner, as he was certified as insane shortly afterwards. Kosminski's overt insanity being one of the key reasons why a couple of policemen active in the period thought he was a good suspect. This offender does not look out of the ordinary. However, the clothing he wears at the time of the assaults is not his everyday dress. He wants to project to unsuspecting female prostitutes that he has money. Consequently, this relieves him from initiating contact. Douglas is surely mistaken here. He had earlier described the poor condition of the victims, which was, if anything, an under-exaggeration. They were invariably desperate for money. The culprit did not have to be smartly dressed in order to attract their contact. He did not need to dress to impress. The only wealth he needed to project was the ability to pay 4 pence. Kosminski also would not realistically have been able to put on smart clothing. Douglas then moves into the realms of psychoanalysis. He comes from a family where he was raised by a domineering mother and weak, passive and/or absent father. In all likelihood, his mother drank heavily and enjoyed the company of many men. As a result, he failed to receive consistent care and contact with stable adult role models. Consequently, he became detached socially and developed a diminished emotional response towards his fellow man. He became asocial, preferring to be alone. There's a lot in here, but it's a bit of a hodgepodge. A domineering mother, an absent father. That sounds like Lechmere. His mother must have been strong-willed. Despite being abandoned by her husband, John Allen Lechmere, she managed to run a long-standing cat's meat business. She conducted 2 bigamous marriages, and she brought up one of Lechmere's daughters. Other women who faced Maria Lechmere's predicament became alcoholics, and some were even the victims of Jack the Ripper. We have no information as to whether she drank, and I frankly doubt it. During Charles Lechmere's formative years, he seems to have been without a male role model, but speculating about other suspects within this category is virtually impossible, as nothing much is known about their backgrounds. And by the way, having a diminished emotional response is a feature of psychopathy. His anger became internalized, and in his younger years he expressed his pent-up destructive emotions by setting fires and torturing small animals. By perpetrating these acts, he discovered increased areas of dominance, power and control, and learned how to continue violent, destructive acts without detection or punishment. As he grew older, his fantasy developed a strong component that included domination, cruelty, and mutilation of women. This very prescriptive analysis of a young psychopath is very dated. Of the suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, not enough is known about any of their childhoods to rule out if they were cruel to animals, for example. This sort of information might have come to light after a culprit was caught, but in formulating a profile for a culprit in this case, it's totally useless. As he grew older, his fantasy developed a strong component that included domination, cruelty, and mutilation of women. We would expect to find evidence of this violent, destructive fantasy life through personal writings of his, as well as drawings of women being mutilated. The only suspects this fits are such unlikely characters as James Maybrick, if we believe his diary to be genuine, or in the paintings of Walter Sickert, or the poetry of Francis Thompson. You would be hard-pressed to find examples of convicted serial killers who kept such drawings prior to arrest. We could include the various Jack the Ripper letters under this category, but I'll come back to this. For employment, he would seek a position where he could work alone and vicariously experience his destructive fantasies. Such employment would include work as a butcher, mortician's helper, medical examiner's assistant or hospital attendant. He is employed Monday through Friday, and on Friday night, Saturday and Sunday is off from work. He has carried a knife for defence purposes. Just in case he was ever attacked, he would be ready. The only suspect I can think who fits this bill is Robert Mann, who worked in the Whitechapel workhouse mortuary, but he was old and infirm and couldn't leave the workhouse at will to prowl the streets at night. And also Jacob Levy, who was a butcher. But it's not at all common to find serial killers in these occupations, so I'm slightly surprised that Douglas was so prescriptive here as well. Saturday was usually a normal working day in 1888, which undermines Douglas's assumption about days off. He's assuming, presumably, that the killer roamed the streets on nights when he didn't have to go to work next morning, which in any event wasn't the case with Polly Nichols, who was murdered on Friday morning, or Martha Tabor, if she's included, murdered on the night before a working day on the following Tuesday. The only murders that took place before a normal day off, a Sunday, were the double event murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The double event murders were exceptions for several reasons. They included the only murder south of the Whitechapel Road axis, if we exclude the Pinchin Street Torso dumping location, the only time where there were two murders on one night, and they took place earlier in the morning than the other murders. These factors are not picked up upon by Douglas. The murders fit a pattern of someone killing before his working day, if anything, with the double event being prior to his day off. I'm not sure why Douglas thinks the culprit would carry a knife in case he was attacked. This seems a strange addition. This paranoid type thinking is in part justified because of the poor self-image he has of himself. He would be expected to have some type of physical abnormality. However, although not severe, he perceives this as being psychologically crippling. We would look for someone below or above average in height and or weight, may have problems with speech, scarred complexion, physical illness or injury. This again is very prescriptive and doesn't really fit for any of the suspects, although Patricia Cornwell suggested that Walter Sickert had an abnormality. We would not expect this type of offender to be married. If he was married in the past, it would have been to someone older than himself, and the marriage would have been for a short duration. I'm not sure how or why Douglas came to this conclusion. Perhaps he saw the culprit as a maladjusted type who wouldn't be able to form a relationship. It used to be the received wisdom that serial killers were loners, unable to form family relationships. Most Jack the Ripper suspects were in fact married. Kosminski and Druitt weren't, but many vicious serial killers had partners. Or perhaps Douglas saw it from a practical point of view, that the culprit must have been a loner so he could come and go as he pleased and hide bloody clothes or body parts in his room. If this is the reason, then most suspects become invalidated. Kosminski lived with his family, Druitt in rooms associated with his school. Which suspect had access to a location where they could hide and clean up? Lechmere, at his workplace, which was a cavernous, labyrinthine maze of dark tunnels with wash facilities. He is not adept in meeting people socially, and the major extent of his heterosexual relationships would be with prostitutes. Due to lack of hygiene practices by prostitutes at the time and the absence of treatment for venereal disease, he may have been infected. If infected, this would further fuel his hatred and disgust for women. This is somewhat contradictory to Douglas's earlier suggestion that the killer must have had good social skills to disarm his victims or at least win their trust. Also, the hatred for women angle contradicts his earlier suggestion that the Jack the Ripper victims were targeted because they were readily accessible. Female prostitutes form by far the largest category of victims, not because the murderer had a grudge against women or prostitutes, but because they are usually physically easier to kill and will willingly accompany the culprit to a lonely spot. Serial killers who kill prostitutes out of a grudge because they contracted venereal disease are not completely unknown, but are very rare. Jacob Levy had syphilis, and this is emphasised by those who favour his suspect status. He would be perceived as being quiet, a loner, shy, slightly withdrawn, obedient and neat, and orderly in appearance, and when working. He drinks in the local pubs, and after a few spirits he becomes more relaxed and finds it easier to engage in conversation. He lives or works in the Whitechapel area. The first homicide should be in close proximity to either his home or workplace. It is noted that London Hospital is only 1 block from the first homicide, and as stated earlier in this analysis, we would expect other violent crimes in this vicinity. I agree in general with Douglas's characterisation of the killer's likely behaviour: unobtrusive, frequenting pubs, looking normal, living and working locally, outwardly behaving obediently, like Lechmere being very respectful of the coroner during his inquest appearance, saying "yes sir, no sir" the whole time. I can't see Kosminski fitting any of these characteristics. The only suspect who does is Lechmere. I don't get the relevance of mentioning the London Hospital, or I will go into this a little bit later on. As always, there's loads more to cover on this episode. Keep watching, but please don't forget to subscribe, share, like and comment below after you've watched the film to say what you think about it all. Investigators would have interviewed him during the course of the investigation, and he was probably talked to by police on several occasions. Unfortunately, at this time, there was no way to correlate this type of information, therefore was overlooked. Investigators and citizens in the community a preconceived idea or picture of what Jack the Ripper would have looked like. Because of the belief that he would appear odd or ghoulish in appearance, he was overlooked and or eliminated as a potential suspect. Regular viewers of this channel will not be surprised to learn that I agree with Douglas completely in this part of his assessment, that the culprit was an everyman that would have come under the eye of the police but would have been dismissed as being of no importance. This is of course quite a regular occurrence in cases of serial killers, from Reginald Christie to Peter Sutcliffe. Of the suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, the only one who really fits these characteristics is Charles Lechmere. The next section was entitled Pre- and Post-Offence Behaviour. Prior to each homicide, the subject was in a local pub drinking spirits while at the same time lowering his inhibitions. He would be observed walking all over the Whitechapel area during the early evening hours. He did not specifically seek a certain look in a woman. However, it was no accident that he killed prostitutes. He had the sense to when and where to attack his victims. There would have been many other women who confronted Jack the Ripper and were not assaulted because the location was not secure enough. I doubt if the killer drank before these crimes. He would have needed his wits about him to escape detection on multiple occasions. I agree that it was no accident that he killed prostitutes. They were the most readily available type of victim, and he must have had local knowledge to know where to find them. And again, I agree that he probably didn't follow through with all the women he interacted with, probably because he didn't feel comfortable with the scenario. Here, Douglas is describing someone who was certainly not overtly mad. Post-offence behaviour would include returning to an area where he could wash his hands of blood and remove his clothing. As I've already said, I think Lechmere is just about the only suspect I can think of who had access to a facility that would potentially have enabled him to clean up. Can you think of any others? We would not expect him to inject himself into the police investigation or provide bogus information. This is an interesting subject, so I'll dwell on it a bit. First of all, I agree that it's very unlikely that the killer would insert himself in this case. This sort of thing only really happens in crime fiction to set up a dramatic conflict between the sleuth and the perpetrator. One only has to think of Columbo's catchphrase, just one more thing. And in every episode of Midsummer Murders, Bergerac, or whoever the detective character is called, would be involved in a battle of wits with the culprit. These shows are very influential, but in the real world this sort of thing is incredibly rare. It's sometimes suggested that in the case of the murder of the two little girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, in Soham in Cambridgeshire in 2002, the culprit Ian Huntley inserted himself into the investigation. He certainly gave several media interviews and helped in the search to find the girls, who were found 13 days after he had murdered them. However, his house was searched the day after the girls went missing, and Huntley's behaviour raised immediate suspicions. He admitted he had spoken to the girls on the day they had disappeared, probably because he was worried that he had been spotted. He also had been previously accused of rape and admitted to his partner, who covered up for him, that the police would find this incriminating. So I don't think you can say that Huntley gratuitously and needlessly inserted himself into the case. Of the Jack the Ripper suspects, Lechmere came forward, but not to insert himself in the case, but because he was obliged to exonerate himself after Robert Paul's remarkable statement was published in a Sunday newspaper. But as soon as possible he receded into the background. Rosalind Donston, or more properly Robert Donston Stevenson, was quite a popular suspect up to maybe 15 years ago, but little is heard of him now, and he is one of the suspects considered in the documentary associated with the FBI report. He was at the London hospital during the Autumn of Terror as an inpatient, and perhaps this why Douglas mentioned him, as I alluded to earlier. That's why Douglas perhaps mentioned the hospital. He involved himself by bringing suspicion on a doctor and writing articles about the case in the press. He was also into black magic, but apparently the ward in which he was staying didn't allow the inpatients to leave at night, which effectively rules him out. It's sometimes suggested by proponents of George Hutchinson as a suspect that he inserted himself in the investigation in the mistaken belief that this makes him a more credible suspect. He came forward with a very elaborate witness statement and was interrogated by Inspector Aberline. He also gave an interview to the press at his lodgings and went out and about with the police trying to find the man he had said he had seen with Mary Kelly. So if he inserted himself quite deeply. But Hutchinson theorists also claim that a witness called Sarah Lewis saw him standing outside Miller's Court, which is where Mary Kelly lived, and this prompted him to come forward. On the face of it, this is similar to the suggestion that Robert Paul's newspaper story prompted Lechmere to come forward. The difference is that we know Paul saw and interacted with Lechmere just around the corner there, and we know that it is perfectly plausible for Lechmere to have read Paul's account, as it was published in a newspaper with the world's biggest circulation the day before he did in fact come forward. Sarah Lewis was a witness at Mary Kelly's inquest, and her testimony cannot have been seen by Hutchinson prior to his appearance at Commercial Street Police Station at 5 p.m. on the day of Mary Kelly's inquest. Furthermore, even though for a few days Hutchinson's account was all over the press, no one at the time, not the newspapers nor the police, connected him to the man Lewis said she saw. The man she described as being short and stout, which presumably can't have matched Hutchinson. So this is another ripperological dead end. Charles Legrand was a suspect once favoured by an American ripperologist called Tom Westcott, known for two quite well received self-published books, The Bank Holiday Murders and Ripper Confidential, and for running a popular Facebook Jack the Ripper page. It was proposed that Legrand inserted himself into the investigation into the murder of Liz Stride. Legrand was a thuggish con man who also specialised in obtaining money through menaces. Then there was Albert Backett, favoured by the popular Jack the Ripper tour guide Mick Priestley, author of One Autumn in Whitechapel. Backett was a local nutter who involved himself with the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and later he got involved in local political feuds. He was also a regular crank letter writer to local East End newspapers. And then there's Francis Tumblety, who can be regarded as someone who inserted himself into the case. At the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, he was arrested for gross indecency with various young boys, a serious offence that carried with it social ruination, as Oscar Wilde found out a few years later. Tumblety fled Britain back to the United States and claimed he had to leave London as he had been falsely accused of being Jack the Ripper. Tumblety was a practised self-publicist, and this technique is called throwing a dead cat on the table. To distract attention away from his disgrace, he threw the Jack the Ripper accusation on the table to blank out the accusations of gross indecency. Tumblety had earlier been accused of involvement in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was never far from controversy. Cases that attract huge media attention, such as Jack the Ripper, are also bound to attract crank attention seekers and unbalanced individuals who like to insert themselves in the case. I would suggest that all the above individuals come into that category. Douglas also addressed the subject of whether any of the Jack the Ripper letters originated from the killer. It is my opinion that this series of homicides was not perpetrated by someone who set up a challenge against law enforcement. While the killer knew he would be receiving national as well as international publicity, this was not his primary motivation. I'll produce a full-length investigative film on the letters in the future, but suffice it to say, I'm far from being emphatically against the idea that some of the letters may have been genuine. The concept of letter writing in association with crime was very new, not least because the penny post was only instituted in 1840 and literacy became widespread around the same time. Without this, the posting of the Jack the Ripper letters wouldn't have been possible. I'm not even sure whether it's the case that any murders prior to the Jack the Ripper murders had been associated with letters claiming to be responsible from the perpetrator. But in my opinion, it's fairly obviously, certainly the case, that the perpetrator was consciously sending a message by the way he posed the victims with their intestines strung out, for example with the bodies of Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes. Also, if we include the Whitechapel torso, this was left in the foundations of New Scotland Yard, which is surely a very direct message to the police. Then there's the Goulston Street graffiti, the Jewer's message that was left on the edge of the door, which may well have been written by the perpetrator. There's the Lipsky graffiti found opposite the arch where the Pinchin Street torso was dumped. So there is plenty of evidence that the killer was prone to challenging law enforcement and leaving messages. Jack the Ripper hunted nightly for his victims. When he could not find another, he returned to the locations where he killed his previous victims. While it's self-evident that Jack the Ripper hunted at night, there's no evidence that he returned to areas where he'd previously been successful when he couldn't find another. Although it might be said that this was the case with, say, Alice Mackenzie, if you agree to include her in the list. She was murdered almost halfway between the earlier murders of Martha Tabram, if you include her, and Catherine Eddowes. So it's all very subjective. If the victims were buried locally, he would visit the grave sites of his victims during the early morning hours for the purpose of reliving his lust murders. The victims weren't buried very locally at all, so it's a very strange point to raise and is frankly irrelevant, but perhaps Douglas wasn't aware where the victims were buried. Jack the Ripper would not have committed blank after the last homicide. Generally, when crimes such as these cease, it is because he came close to being identified, was interviewed by the police, or was arrested for some other type of offence. As stated previously in this report, we would be surprised if Jack the Ripper would suddenly stop. However, we've seen this happen before, and generally it has been because of the above stated reasons. Serial killers seldom, if ever, suffer from pangs of guilt or introspective contemplation, so ending it in a Druid-like manner without uttering the word you're not allowed to use on YouTube is extremely unlikely, as Douglas correctly states. Psychopathic serial killers are not prone to such reactions. And as Douglas also said, there are many reasons why a serial killer might stop. Nothing can really be ruled out or ruled in. And furthermore, as Douglas said earlier on, we don't know that the Mary Kelly murder was the last one, so he may not have stopped, then at least. In real life, complex events seldom have binary solutions. Rather than black and white, you have shades of grey. As one might expect, the Douglas report is a mixture of sensible observations, out-of-date thinking and inaccurate generalisations, often caused by a lack of detailed knowledge about the case. Douglas came out in the TV show The Secret Identity of Jack the Ripper in favour of Kosminski as the most likely suspect. True, any shortlist that includes Prince Albert Victor and Sir William Gull is very weak, and arguably Douglas didn't have much to choose from. But Kosminski fails to meet multiple of the criteria that Douglas himself set, as we have seen. No doubt some of you will disagree with some or all of the assessments I've made of this report. A lot is based on subjective opinion and interpretation of evidence. If nothing else, it shows that it's not wise to slavishly follow the findings of one old report. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please subscribe for free, share and like to help those old YouTube algorithms, and comment below. I always try to go through every comment with a fine-tooth comb. What do you think?